and I've got one more.
Today I'll take you through the steps I took to create a scene from the Eastern Front, where I pair the tack-on Halftrack from a few weeks ago with an unfinished diorama base from a few years ago, and trial a few new techniques along the way. This diorama was originally planned to be used with my 48 scale nashorn, one of my early subjects on this channel, some of you may remember, but for one reason or another it never actually came to fruition. It's been sitting on my bench now for nearly 2 years, just staring at me. I'm sure you guys know that feeling. But finally I think I have the opportunity to use it and create a little scene. I'd created a couple of cardboard templates to help gauge the scale of these huts, and I proceeded to cut small pieces of dowel to fit. To create a grain in that dowel, the edge of a razor saw can be used to drag over the length and create recesses and trenches. That, once painted, should present nicely as a grain, and sanding the length also helps remove any fluff or splinters that process created. The template I'd made then could be used to set the foundations for the shapes of the walls. However, I needed to add a strip of copper wire through the centre of those dowels to that structure to stop it from warping. Again, using the template as a guide, the shape of the roof is marked, and a razor saw can be used to straighten up the edges. A square section of balsa wood can then be glued in place to set the foundations of that roof, but it also tidies up the angles that I just cut. A similar technique was used for the return walls, only instead of the dowel, rectangular section of balsa wood was used to represent that style seen in the reference image here. After test fitting the structure to the foam base, the walls could be held in place using a 2-part epoxy glue. It was then about creating the crossbeams for the roof with thin sheets of balsa hand trim to match that rough, irregular finish in that reference picture. Super glue was adequate for these joints because there wasn't a lot of load, plus it was drying nice and fast. Watching the roof come together was strangely satisfying, and adding the fascia boards to cap it off added another element to the construction. Support beams were glued in place for the flooring, and once the angles were established, thin floorboards were scribed into a single piece of balsa wood. A blade could then be used to create the damage over the sections at the end before fitting them in place. For the thatching on that roof, I had initially begun using strands of papyrus. A Gorilla Grip glue had enough body and dimension to it that I could glue clumps of that papyrus in place over the cross beams, and I was never really happy with the scale of that thatching, which is why I suspect I stalled with this diorama all those years ago. Pressing on though, and I cut a strip of foam and set about sculpting the stones for the foundations of the building. This is XPS foam, and it makes for a great medium for this type of work and can be trimmed and manipulated using a toothpick. And then to add some texture over the faces, a crunched up piece of alfoil can be pressed against the surface. It's hardly rocket science, but should give me the look that I was after. Back to the foam base, and a hot wire cutter is used to carve some ruts through where that road section will be, and a thin layer of moulding clay is worked in over the top to create my groundwork. I probably wouldn't bother with this step anymore and probably would just go at it with the terrain space now, but this is how I did it back then, hence you are seeing it here now. And as the clay dried, it cracked pretty badly, so I will have to address that. But in the meantime, the cabin structures could be glued in place. This is something that I wish I hadn't have done because, as you'll see with the painting stages, it certainly would have been easier to paint these things if they weren't attached to the base. However, to correct that groundwork, I went straight to the VMS Smart Mud and began applying it over that modelling clay. Now this can get quite messy, so I'd recommend a pair of gloves as well as a few different silicone brushes to manipulate it into place. The finish and look were so much better than the direction I had it heading previously, and it instantly transformed that landscape. Once that mud paste had fully dried, white glue was distributed in a patchy manner around the groundwork, avoiding the trail, and while it was still wet, static grass was loaded into the static grass applicator and sprinkled over the scene. The applicator runs off a couple of double D batteries and it charges the grass fibres, which in turn makes them stand up on end as they hit the groundwork, and the result should be a natural looking blade of grass. I could then go back with a different colour and longer fibre static grass and selectively apply clumps around the setting. Adding variation like this helps to present those elements in a more natural and believable way. But it was time to address that thatching again, and it had really been bothering me so much. And I found these reeds to have the consistency I was looking for and set about gluing them over the roof. The papyrus actually gave me a good foundation to build this effect over, so that element hadn't been a complete waste of time. It was here I placed the newly finished Halftrack in the setting and became inspired to press on with this scene. The size was just about perfect and the composition was working pretty well. It was almost like this base had been waiting for this moment. The original idea for this was always going to be called The Bear Hunt, and now it was exciting to watch the same scene evolving but with a completely different vehicle and figures. The poses of the figures out of that dragon set were just about perfect, and with the addition of an upgraded Hornet head, the story was starting to materialise. It's amazing the difference an aftermarket head can make to even the most basic styrene figure. And then by hiding a couple of wounded Russian tankers in the cabin, I could also have the story unfold as the viewer moved around the piece. I'd recently spent some time with world-renowned figure painter and all-round great guy Calvin Tan. I learnt a lot from Calvin during the one-day workshop I was lucky enough to have been included in. Now Calvin has a new set of figure paints available through AK, all based around painting skin tones. Calvin's methods use the new AK line of quick gen paints to establish shadows and the deepest tones, and these quick gen paints are similar to an ink or a contrast style of paint and are designed to sit through recesses and produce naturally highlighted areas over a figure. Once established, the technique uses the standard line of Gen 3 acrylics to start building up the mid-tones. The light flesh covers the bulk of the surface areas over the face, and the trick with this layer is thinning the paint using the ultra matte varnish. The varnish creates a glaze of sorts and should allow for smoother graduations in the paintwork as I move through the tones. Light flesh and basic skin tone are then mixed again with that matte varnish and painted over an even smaller surface area. Building the flesh highlights up over the nose, the chin and the top of the cheeks is all I'm looking to do here. Then I'm moving back to those quick gen paints now, and the dark flesh is thinned with an acrylic thinner and used to apply a wash again in the recesses around the eyes, the nose and the mouth and the deepest areas on the face. And then the final round of highlighting is created using an ivory, again thinned with the ultra matte varnish. The transitions and tones are then balanced with a heavily thinned mix of Gen 3 human flesh. This concept is pretty similar to how I usually paint, only the paint mediums and techniques are a little different. I would usually get my flesh tones with acrylics and look to define shadows with oils, but I'm prepared to trust the process for these figures and see where it takes me. For the pants, I first applied my darkest tone of German grey with the colour from the German uniform paint set, and once fully dry, started to add midtones and highlights over the shapes and folds in the uniforms. The real game changer for me here was combining the paint with the ultramatte varnish. The ability it gave me to gradually build up the colours without defined brush strokes and obvious graduation lines was terrific, and this is a technique I will definitely be using moving forward. It allows you to keep the paint semi-translucent and still gives it excellent uniform coverage over the surface you are painting. Here you can see the colours I used for the tunic. The field grey base from the AK set is my mid-tone, and that is lightened using a skin tone and darkened using the quick gen field grey for the shadows. Using the skin tone to lighten the colour instead of white should keep the colour in my green tones, whereas a white can desaturate it and make it look chalky. By again cutting the paint with that ultramatte varnish, I am creating a glaze style of paint which will help alleviate the marks and noticeable graduation in the paint. As I apply the highlights, I'm looking to cover a smaller surface area with each of the lighter colours that goes down. It's also worth noting that making multiple passes once the paint is dry allows the colour to build up in opacity and adds body to that colour layer. The equipment could then be painted and detailed using a thinned mix of those Gen 3 colours to set the foundations. Now, thinning this paint with the acrylic thinner allows me to paint and distribute it over the part cleanly without it pooling, and it's a better thinning medium than just water alone. Keeping the paint wet allows me to easily brush paint the details around the figure. Most of this painting is done with a size 2 brush, but for some of that tighter detail work a finer brush is used and a heck of a lot of squinting. I then look to re-establish and blend the highlights that I just created by using a quick gen field grey paint around naturally shadowed areas and through folds and recesses. The paint brings back the richness in that colour and helps create greater contrast over the figure whilst blending in any graduation lines. The paintwork is then sealed with a VMS matte varnish, and after 24 hours I look to bring more definition over the details with a targeted oil wash. Yes, I understand this is a default position for me, but I needed to go back to a technique that was familiar. Figure painting is something that you need to invest time in to improve. But for me, the biggest challenge with it is settling on a style and stop looking for a magic formula. I've only touched on the process here, but after painting these figures, I feel like I have finally found my technique, and I promise to make a dedicated figure painting tutorial next year. To further detail the figures, the foil from the top of a wine bottle can be trimmed, folded and attached to the rifles with a small touch of super glue. It is a basic element that probably could have been detailed a little better on my part, but should add a nice organic element to the poses. But back to the buildings, and to paint them, the model was first primed in a VMS white primer. I like the look of the thatching and the groundwork for that matter, so I focused the primer on the buildings and would look to blend the groundwork in during the painting process. I do love these AK Gen 3 paint sets because they can take all the guesswork out of your colour choices, and for me, being low-key colourblind, I find it really helpful. Using muted tones of greys and greens, I proceed to paint each of the logs and slats as randomly as I could. Colour variation at this stage will set the foundations for this technique, and applying the paint heavily diluted will help that colour mix and blend. I then introduced the grains I'd carved with a razor saw earlier, and I did this by using a diluted mix of black ink. Now I've had this ink on the shelf for a couple of years and this is the first time I've actually used it. Now by varying the amounts of water in with the ink, I can limit the effect and create further variation across that grain look. To dress the foam base, I'd usually do it with thin sheets of styrene and integrate some sort of a graphic on it, but I wanted to try something nicer for this one and picked myself up some timber veneer. By backing it with a mounting film, I could then apply it around the base and it instantly changed the whole look of the display. This is a really simple thing to do and it makes a basic piece of foam look quite high end. I have added some Amazon links down below for you for that timber veneer and that mounting tape if you wanted to try this for yourself. That 3M film is actually pretty expensive, but it's pretty bulletproof. That veneer can then easily be trimmed with a sharp blade following the contours of the terrain. To integrate the edges, an AK Terrains paste is carefully applied around that perimeter to disguise the lip of the timber veneer. And then once dry, the edges can be sanded flush with a sanding block. I wasn't entirely happy with the finish on the cabins, so a thinned mix of RLM 76 and then later a little bit of buff was sprayed to soften and blend the look of some of those logs. By keeping this paint reasonably thin, it will make that colour quite translucent, which should still allow those colours I created earlier to show through. This is designed to enhance the look rather than to hide it. I could also blend in the look of that thatching that had been affected by the priming of that timber earlier. A hay colour static grass is laid over the floor of the interior of the cabins and set in place using a sand and ballast freeze. By first adding a few drops of acrylic thinner, I'm able to break the surface tension and that sand and ballast freeze will be allowed to flow and migrate far more freely through the static grass fibres by doing that step. Time to set the figures in place by drilling a small hole for that piece of rod I glued into their feet earlier, and a touch of PVA glue could hold them in place. A small title was designed and cut on my vinyl cutting machine and it was set in place in the bottom right corner of the base. I just felt from a balance point of view it worked better down there, and hunting the bear was now complete. One of my goals for next year is to be a little more considered and be better prepared as to how I plan on presenting my models. I tend to rush headlong into the model build with a vision of how I want it to look, but then I get to the end of the build and I don't have a clear picture of what the display should look like. Yes, the scene usually evolves and comes together in the end, but I feel like I'd save myself a lot of angst and be better able to finesse the model during construction if I was to plan that one stage further than I have in the past. It was nice to see the diorama base I started years ago finally get used. Even though it wasn't the vehicle or the scene I had in mind, I think it came together reasonably well. As 2025 comes to a close, I take time to reflect on the amazing journey this channel has taken me on and all the wonderful people I've connected with right across the globe. Starting this channel has quite literally changed my life, so to you all I'm truly grateful, but an extra level of gratitude to the beautiful community we are building over on the Patreon page. I'm posting regular content there on that platform, and it is a place that you can get in touch with me and talk all things models. I can guarantee if you're looking to improve your own modelling, there is no better place to start. I'll be taking a bit of a break over this Christmas holiday period from this regular style of video. However, I have a few plans to keep you entertained through Christmas, New Year period, so hold tight and I'll see what I can piece together for you. Remember guys, this is the greatest hobby in the world. Share it with your family and share it with your friends. And to you and your family, I wish you the happiest of Christmas and a safe and prosperous New Year. Until next time, I will see you soon.
Have a drink, will you? Merry Christmas.